Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the second video in a two-part series on the topic of why the critics adored The Last Jedi and why the fans did not. In the last video, I analysed reviews praising The Last Jedi and tried to determine what they liked about the film. I'll put the link to that video in the description. The point of this series is to try and uncover why the critics liked The Last Jedi, and to see whether they like Solo, a Star Wars story, and make guesses about Solo's quality based on an analysis of their reviews for both films. Now, to ensure that there was some reliability between the ratings, I analysed the reviews of the same publications which reviewed The Last Jedi. Unfortunately, all the critics were different even though the publications were the same, except for one. Forbes' reviews of The Last Jedi and Solo, a Star Wars story, were both written by the same man, a professional film correspondent called Scott Mendelson. Now, I had a hypothesis that Solo, a Star Wars story, would be like The Last Jedi, and the critics would adore the film. That hasn't actually happened. The reviews of Solo are far more interesting than the ones of The Last Jedi. These are the critics whose reviews I am analysing, and the publications they are writing for. A.O. Scott of the New York Times, Scott Mendelson of Forbes, Michael Rechtshaffen of The Hollywood Reporter, Johnny Oleksinski of the New York Post, Dan Jolin of Empire, Peter Bradshaw of The Guardian, Geoffrey Macnab of The Independent, Brian Viner of the Daily Mail, David Sexton of the London Evening Standard, Anna Smith of the Metro, and Andy Lee of the Daily Express. Not all the publications gave scores of the film. I am now going to name the publications which did give scores and the scores they gave. The New York Post gave Solo, a Star Wars story 1 out of 5 stars. Empire gave it 4 out of 5. The Guardian gave it 4 out of 5. The Independent also gave it 4 out of 5. The Daily Mail gave it 3 out of 5. The London Evening Standard gave it 4 out of 5. And the Metro gave it 3 out of 5, along with the Daily Express. So without more to do, let's look at the statements made concerning the technical and cinematic aspects of the film, which was an area of praise for the critics of The Last Jedi. As Forbes stated that, some odd lighting issues aside, Ron Howard offers a flick with the kinetic energy of Rush and the kid-friendly fantasy appeal of Willow. Not exactly high praise. The Hollywood Reporter, however, is far nicer. From a visual standpoint, the production admittedly looks quite lovely, with cinematographer Bradford Young and production designer Neil Lamont establishing some strikingly resonant delineations in the contrasting industrial, desert, alpine, intergalactic landscapes. The Daily Mail didn't like the colour of the film. It's nowhere near as much of a blast as the last standalone film, 2016's wildly enjoyable Rogue One, and it is mystifyingly dark, in colour, rather than in content, almost as if the film stock has been washed in ditch water. But the Daily Mail was more approving of the special effects. The action zips along, with the help of some predictably terrific special effects, but as a whole it feels more functional than exhilarating. The Daily Express did what it did with The Last Jedi, and heaped on the praise. If you're after slick action scenes, spectacular special effects, and exhaustive explanations for every reference to a key character's past, this is the blockbuster you've been looking for. We shall now examine the statements on humour. Unlike with The Last Jedi, the critics had less to say about the humour. Scott Mendelson of Forbes said, Phoebe Waller-Bridge wins laughs as the voice of Lando's robot. The Hollywood Reporter also was a fan of the robot. The criminally too briefly seen L337, a hilarious motion-captured Phoebe Waller-Bridge. The Guardian made this statement, which I assume to be praise. Their wacky stage fight is a beguiling moment, as Han fixes to break Chewie free to become his pal and wingman in so many senses. The Independent, however, makes a far less ambiguous statement. Thankfully, he shares Ford's deadpan humour and folksy, all-American quality. He never gets flustered, and always has a wisecrack, even at the most precarious moments. He'll grin cheerfully after the spaceship he is piloting is very nearly blown to smithereens, and pretend he was in control all along. It's an engaging performance that strikes just the right balance of humour and heroism. The Daily Express had a brief statement saying that Han was all goofy charm, which doesn't seem to be negative in context. The action was also broadly well received. The New York Times said, "There are some fine action sequences, and some that don't make much sense at all." Scott Mendelson of Forbes said, "The kind of action we get, the opening speeder chase, the big first act train robbery, shootouts, fistfights, etc., have a grounded pulp sensibility, different from mythic lightsaber fights and grim fog of war combat. This chapter was made by folks of the same generation as George Lucas himself. Howard and Kasdan were inspired not by Lucas, but rather the movies that inspired Lucas. So, especially considering the lead character, it's probably no coincidence that this is a Star Wars flick that resembles an Indiana Jones movie." The Daily Mail was far less eloquent. "The action zips along, with the help of some predictably terrific special effects, but as a whole it feels more functional than exhilarating." The Metro, however, enjoyed it a bit more. "Ron Howard's film isn't the most complex of the recent Star Wars movies, but it's a light, entertaining watch with enough action, party scenes, and origins drama to satisfy Solo fans prepared to see him in a new body." The Daily Express went further. "If you're after slick action scenes, spectacular special effects, and exhaustive explanations for every reference to a key character's past, this is the blockbuster you've been looking for." The reviewers had a lot to say about the acting in Solo: A Star Wars Story, mainly concerning Ehrenreich's performance. The New York Times said, "There are a handful of second characters who come close to upstaging the hero, including Beckett's companion, Val, Fandy Newton, a radical droid called L337, Phoebe Waller-Bridge, and Lando Calrissian, Donald Glover, the original owner of the Millennium Falcon, Han's sometimes rival and secret ego ideal, and of course Chewbacca, Jonas Suamato." The New York Post said, "As for Ehrenreich, the 28-year-old actor is a major emerging talent. He was exceptional in Hail Caesar, and here he is a likable, believable romantic lead. But that's all. Poor Ehrenreich has been set up to fail by being given an almost impossible task, to make us forget about Harrison Ford, easily the most iconic action hero in modern cinema. No actor alive can match Ford's unique mix of humour, easygoing heroics, and all-American tude. He's the only person who could sell a standalone Han Solo movie." Scott Mendelson of Forbes, however, was far happier with Ehrenreich's performance. "Alden Ehrenreich makes a fine protagonist, offering hints of the man Harrison Ford first played in 1977, but offering a star turn unique unto itself. If you've seen Beautiful Creatures and Hail Caesar, then you know the kid has the goods. So whatever went on behind the scenes, it doesn't show in his performance." And then he goes on to talk about the rest of the cast. "Harrison could play his Long John Silverish mentor in his sleep, but he's too much of a pro to phone it in. Donald Glover's Lando Calrissian is pure charm and attitude, but the movie feels the need to have characters point that out. When you've got Glover wearing a cape on top of another cape, having characters preemptively note his splendidness is as redundant as Uma Thurman's Poison Ivory having to blow pheromones at men to make them fall in love with her." He also said of the villain, "Paul Bettany is having a blast as an icy cold gangster for whom Harrison works and for whom our gang of multi-anti-heroes engage in one last job. Linda Hunt briefly voices a Fagin-type creature who lorded over Han as an orphan. Emilia Clarke is the girl, although I will happily admit, no details, that her arc goes somewhere different than on the feared young Sherlock Holmes path. Phoebe Waller-Bridge wins laughs as the voice of Lando's robot, while Fandy Newton is underutilized. They are all in service of a conventional heist plot, and in service of Han Solo's growth. But they are good company, and provide good fun amid the action." The Hollywood Reporter had this to say of Ehrenreich: "Obviously the person with the most to prove here is Ehrenreich, who previously managed to steal a few scenes of his own as all-shucks cowboy actor Hobby Doyle in the Coen brothers' Hail Caesar, and he captures enough of Ford's genial swagger to earn Solo bragging rights, even if the performance could have withstood a few smirks and winks." Empire had nothing bad to say on the acting front. Before Lord and Miller departed, they definitely made the right choice with Alden Ehrenreich, previously best enjoyed on screen as the smooth-faced Western star in the Coen brothers' Hail Caesar. With a glowing smirk and a knack for the wisecrack, he fills Harrison Ford's boots with roguish panache, even if young Han himself spends much of his time here as the passenger in other older characters' schemes. The Guardian said, "Alden Ehrenreich absolutely crushes the role to powder, swaggingly reviving the memory of the young Harrison Ford's romantic gallantry." The Independent decided to go into detail. Solo is played by Alden Ehrenreich, the immensible, likeable young actor who starred as the fresh-faced, Audie Murphy-like movie cowboy in the Coen brothers' Hollywood satire Hail Caesar. In truth, Ehrenreich is quite different from Harrison Ford in the same role. he's smaller and less intense. Thankfully, he shares Ford's deadpan humour and folksy all-American quality. He never gets flustered and always has a wisecrack, even at the most precarious moments. He'll grin cheerfully after the spaceship he is piloting is very nearly blown to smithereens, and pretend he was in control all along. It's an engaging performance that strikes just the right balance of humour and heroism. The Daily Mail said, the American actor Alden Ehrenreich apparently pipped Britain's Taron Egerton and Ireland's Jack Reinhardt to the title role, and does a decent job, but he lacks Ford's screen presence, that enigmatic charisma he had even as a young man. The London Evening Standard said, as young Han, 28-year-old Alden Ehrenreich channels Harrison Ford's mannerisms well enough, while giving the character a punky twist of his own, although his pash, London Evening Standard, I am very disappointed, for choir never quite fires up. The Metro had this to say of the acting and the film. It also works as an enjoyable standalone movie to introduce kids to the character, despite Alden Ehrenreich's lack of resemblance to a young Harrison Ford. That said, the Hail Caesar actor still has a winning, laconic grin and a mischievous eye sparkle, qualities that win over girlfriend choir Game of Thrones Emilia Clarke. And, after a few fun action sequences, the pace starts to drag until the gang enter the glamorous world of the deliciously villainous Drayden Voss, played by a pitch-perfect Paul Bettany. The Daily Express said, Ehrenreich's performance serves the plot well enough. He is all goofy charm and bouncy enthusiasm, so we know something will happen to turn him into the grumpy cynic we met in the first Star Wars film. Now, of course, there was no Reylo to talk about in Solo, but some of the publications did share their thoughts on Han and Quiri's relationship. The Empire said, thankfully, however, Han's closest companion is given exactly as much attention as you'd hope for, and we're not talking about Clarke as Kyra, who sadly turns out to be the film's weakest link. As a romantic pairing, she and Ehrenreich sadly just don't pop. The Guardian, however, is far more positive. But wait! To his astonishment, Han is to come face-to-face with Kyra again at one of Drayden's sophisticated parties. Of all the interplanetary cocktail events in all the galaxy, she had to walk into this one. There's a spark between them still, but she's no longer the fresh-faced girl he knew. Now she's a beautiful, formidable woman, and the kept girlfriend of Drayden. Can Han save her from this? I presume that this is how the reviewer at The Guardian would prefer this paragraph to be read out. The Metro had a short statement referring to aspects of the relationship. That said, the Hail Caesar actor still has a winning, laconic grin and a mischievous eye sparkle, qualities that win over girlfriend Kyra Game of Thrones Emilia Clarke. And of course, no newspaper review of a film would be complete without some commentary on feminism/identity politics, or just politics. The New York Times said, it's not really Mr. Ehrenreich's fault that he doesn't evoke Harrison Ford. It's more that the timeline can't quite adjust. Guys like the old Han Solo belong to the past. We're all supposed to be much nicer now. Scott Mendelson of Forbes makes an ambiguous statement. Also, nitpick alert. Solo presents a sexually charismatic black leading man and pairs him up with a robot, while treating the idea of Solo eventually winning the Millennium Falcon away from its black captain as quasi-manifest destiny. Now, I know he probably made this comment because he was motivated by some political agenda, because Scott Mendelson is the author and reviewer of an article called As Solo a Star Wars Story Flops, Are Movies About White Men Box Office Poison? The Hollywood Reporter said, also figuring into the lively character mix is Paul Bettany's power-hungry psychopathic Drayden Voss, and the criminally too briefly seen L337, a hilarious motion-captured Phoebe Waller-Bridge. Truly a self-made astromech droid. She built herself up from various parts she acquired, who has an emotionally complicated relationship with Calrissian. Empire also wanted to talk about the robot, and the interesting relationship she/it has with Calrissian. Interestingly, new characters come in too, and head out of the frame a little too briskly, whether it's Fandy Newton's salty career criminal Val, or Fleabag's Phoebe Waller-Bridge as the right-hand droid to Lando Calrissian, who believes in equal rights with organic life, and is utterly convinced Lando has a thing for her. Intriguingly, neither the script nor Glover's performance do much to convince us otherwise. To be honest, I haven't seen the film, but I have heard differently. The Metro also wanted to talk about the droid again. Scarred and supercilious, he sends them on a mission that will draw in a cluster of other fun characters, including Donald Glover's Lando, and a droid co-pilot called L3, who is hurrah female. and voiced by Fleabag's Phoebe Waller-Bridge. Strangely enough, I can't remember any publications or newspapers or reviewers shouting with delight when this female droid appeared in The Phantom Menace. Apparently everyone wants to talk about the droid because even the London Evening Standard does it. They need a fast ship like the Millennium Falcon, owned by gambler Lando Calrissian, charismatic Donald Glover, whose chief assistant is his beloved droid L337, brilliantly voiced by Phoebe Waller-Bridge as a Mardi droidist demanding her rights. Now, although some of these statements, such as the London Evening Standard one, do not praise the droid as such, the fact that there is no criticism of the droid suggests that they are approving not only the droid's political agenda, but also the obvious parallels which are supposed to be invoked by the droid. Postmodernism / deconstruction of the light versus dark archetype. I couldn't find any quotes, statements, or proclamations of appreciation or celebration of a postmodernist deconstruction of the light versus dark archetype in any of the papers in my sample. However, this is probably less to do with the critics appreciating archetypal stories. I have read enough reviews in the media to know that the vast majority of critics hate fairy tales and archetypes, and more to do with the fact that Solo, a Star Wars story, is a film about anti-heroes committing crimes to try and appease a ruthless gang lord. By its nature, the film isn't an archetypical tale, although there is a strong argument that the thief with a heart of gold is an archetypical character. So if my examination of the reviews of The Last Jedi is anything to go by, this sort of story is right up the critic's alley. Conclusion. My study is now concluded. The goal was to analyse reviews from a sample of newspapers so I could try and uncover what the critics liked about these new Star Wars films and where they differed from the fans. My hypothesis was that Solo would be like The Last Jedi, and we would see near universal praise of the film from these publications. But that hasn't happened. The critics have still broadly commended the film, but the critical acclaim certainly isn't as high as it was for The Last Jedi. The audience score is better, however. The majority of the viewers in my sample come to a point where they admit that Solo, a Star Wars story, is mediocre, and according to Rotten Tomatoes, the average audience reviewer score is 3.3 out of 5, so it would seem that there is some consensus among the critics and the audience members concerning the film. Nevertheless, there are three trends from the first sample that are still strong in this one, and that is the reviewer's love of politics, good acting, and humour. Alden Ehrenreich is the one mostly being praised for acting talent, and the humorous and political applause is mainly centered about the droid called L337, and even though I haven't watched the film, I have watched reactions of the audience to this character, and it is negative. Very negative. Now, my preliminary conclusion in my last video on this subject was that the critics were ignorant of what Star Wars fans liked about the previous installments, and what they want from these new films. However, after reading through the reviews in my sample, I have come to a new conclusion based on watching The Last Jedi, consuming media about The Last Jedi and Solo, made by fans, and reading articles reviewing both these films. Please note that I have not seen Solo, a Star Wars story, and unless I can use my majestic influence to acquire a free seat in the cinema, and ensure that not a single penny goes to Lucasfilm as a result of my viewing it, I won't be reviewing Solo for a while. So again, this is my final conclusion of this two-part series based on watching The Last Jedi, consuming media about The Last Jedi and Solo, made by fans, and reading articles reviewing both those films. I think that these are the three reasons for the vast difference in opinion between the fans and the critics of The Last Jedi. Number 1. The Last Jedi was deconstructing Star Wars, subverting expectations, destroying the light versus dark dynamic, and replacing it with grey morality and ruining Luke's character were all things that the critics either openly or tacitly approved in their reviews. Number 2. Progressive politics were present in The Last Jedi. Many of the articles in my sample praised the presence of progressive politics in The Last Jedi, and even publications such as the Daily Mail and the Daily Express did not challenge the socialist/feminist rubbish being thrown at the audience. And finally, the shill connection. Disney owns vast sections of the media industry in the United States, and if you actually investigate the connections between many of the film companies in America, you discover that many are linked to the House of Mouse in some way. Thus, Disney does actually have the power to blacklist journalists, critics, and reviewers who do not praise and recommend their big-budget films to the masses. I do not believe that Disney actually buys reviews, but it probably awards perks to critics who come to pre-screenings and give positive reviews for their films, while not allowing critics who are more critical to attend said pre-screenings. Of course, I have no proof that any of these reviewers are actually terrified thralls of Disney or Lucasfilm, but it is hard not to suspect that this might have been a factor in the critical praise of The Last Jedi, and I shall elucidate this point further in just a minute. But how does this explain the far more lukewarm reception which Solo: A Star Wars Story has received from professional reviewers? 1. Solo doesn't embrace postmodern deconstructionism. Solo is not an archetypical tale of good versus evil, but a greater story of anti-heroes facing very evil men. So I believe this will have already made the film more palatable to critics. However, unlike The Last Jedi, Solo doesn't seem to be engaging in postmodernist deconstructionism, and while some have claimed the film has ruined Han's character, I suspect that wasn't Lord and Miller's, Howard's, or even the Kasdan's intention. However, it certainly seems to have been the intention of the Kasdans to ruin Lando's character, so my best guess is that the critics weren't as impressed with the film on this front, because there was no active deconstructionism or self-aware attacks made on the mythos of Star Wars. 2. Progressive politics aren't as prevalent in Solo: A Star Wars Story. The articles only mention L337 as the progressive element in the film. There are no mentions of matriarchies, racial representation, or socialist talking points which were present in the reviews of The Last Jedi, making me think that perhaps Solo: A Star Wars Story isn't as progressive as the critics would like it to be. 3. The shill was not strong with this one. Let's go straight to the point here. The Last Jedi was a massive production, and Lucasfilm's next film in the story of Star Wars. The majority of Star Wars fans were hyped for the film, and the success of the next film, Episode 9, depended, and still depend, greatly on a good reception. If The Last Jedi received criticism from every corner, it would look very bad, and be embarrassing for not only Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm, but also for Disney. So it makes sense that Disney would use its clout and power to try and persuade the critics to sing The Last Jedi's praises. Not so with Solo. On the same day Solo was being released in Great Britain and the United States, a standalone Boba Fett film was announced to be in the making. This declaration, which would have excited me if Kathleen Kennedy wasn't still in charge, seriously, expect James Mangold to be fired during the production, tells us one thing: Lucasfilm and Kathleen Kennedy had written off Solo: A Star Wars Story as a failure before it even started playing on screens. Solo lost its first 2 directors in the middle of production, and when Ron Howard was hired, there were reshoots, and this made Solo a more expensive film than The Force Awakens. For something that is supposed to resemble a type of B-movie, this isn't good, and apparently Kathleen Kennedy and Lucasfilm thought so as well. With the producers basically deciding that the film would bomb, and with everyone already aware of Solo's production issues, there was likely no motive to try and persuade the critics to compliment the film. Why bother paying or threatening critics if you think that hardly anyone will see the film, and that those who do will hate it anyway? Also, because Solo: A Star Wars Story is a sideshow film, it wouldn't be worth the effort to try and intimidate the critics into commending it. That type of pressure can wait till Episode 9. So to summarise, the critics liked The Last Jedi because it was deconstructing Star Wars, it contained progressive politics, and Disney was encouraging them to shill, and the reason Solo: A Star Wars Story hasn't received as much critical acclaim is because the film didn't do enough to deconstruct Star Wars. It didn't contain enough progressive politics, and Disney wasn't encouraging the critics to shill. Of course, this is just what I've managed to conclude from reading the reviews written by professional critics. I have no way of proving that these are the precise reasons, but this is just the conclusion of my thoughts from this study. I shall now complete the experiment part of this series by envisaging the quality of Solo: A Star Wars Story. From all the reviews I have read concerning The Last Jedi and Solo: A Star Wars Story, I guess that the film is probably better and more enjoyable than The Last Jedi. Whether this means that Solo is a good film or worth watching, that I cannot say. But I predict that when and if I watch it, I will enjoy it more than The Last Jedi. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have an excellent day. Just a few points to end with. I still think that the critics are largely ignorant of what Star Wars fans liked about the original trilogy, and even the prequel trilogy. I haven't come to a new conclusion in this video, as much as I have modified and added to my preliminary conclusion to make it more comprehensive. I do not think that I was very clear, but I hope this clarifies some of my statements. I also forgot to talk about how there is seemingly less comedy in Solo: A Star Wars Story, as the comical praise is significantly less than it was for The Last Jedi, which suggests that perhaps Solo: A Star Wars Story is not as humorous, quote-unquote, as The Last Jedi, in the critics' opinion. And yes, I am well aware that I have mispronounced Ehrenreich throughout this video. Lastly, A subscriber sent me this. Inspect it and see if you can notice any trends.